there's two things I want to cover this morning, and then also leave a bit of time for any last questions that you might have. First, just some sort of more general advice, and then secondly, how to sort of set up our day in a very good way to support the sort of practices that we did in this retreat. So first is, and a lot of these points I've mentioned throughout the retreat, but just to re-emphasise some of the important points. First is to really avoid unrealistic expectations. And particularly the expectation that somehow by gathering some new knowledge that somehow our life will automatically be transformed. It won't. Knowledge is only, or intellectual knowledge is simply the basis to then be able to do some sort of transformation in our life. But knowledge itself won't really change much. We need to, of course, internalise that and integrate it into our life if we really want to see some change in our life. Sort of a classic example of that, of course, is now, and I mentioned this a few times, now I think we all have intellectual knowledge of impermanence. We know that intellectually. Science has conclusively proved that, but is that really helping us in our life? Not really. I mean, if we thought about it all the time, it may help a bit. So if we really want that to help us, then we need to internalise that through, in this case, the Vipashyana practice of impermanence, to really come to really experientially taste that impermanence, and then that can really flow into our daily life and really then be more in harmony with the flow of life than sort of fighting against it, using that flow to our advantage. And then, of course, also to avoid this expectation of like this, you need a quick fix, I want it and I want it now. Because if we have craving and attachment, that's just going to set us up for a lot of frustration and disappointment. So to really release that as much as possible and just in the present moment, of course, implement these ideas, and then things will change over time. So to have this really long-term perspective, because what we'll find, particularly as a beginner, in the short term, there's going to be a lot of up and down. So not to have this expectation that, my meditation this week should be as good as last week, probably should be a little bit better than last week. If we have this expectation, we're just going to get frustrated, because there's a lot of up and down. And remember, a good meditation is not so much a meditation where our mind is very quiet and still and focused, and a bad meditation is when our mind is all over the place or very drowsy. Because from one day to the next, our mind is very variable. So it's not so much what is important is not so much what happens to us, but how we respond to what happens to us. And it's that will really determine whether we progress or whether we inflict a lot of suffering on ourselves. And of course, we're trying to transform our mind. And that's, of course, an internal transformation. So what we do not want to do, which I see a lot of in India, is make a big outward display of it. Often people in India, they go and shave their heads and put on this funky Buddhist clothing and walk around telling everyone how spiritual they are. And spiritual ego is actually one of the worst, because it has this sense of superiority. I'm spiritual, and you, I'm better than you. So we don't want the ego to hijack our spiritual practice. And of course, if we make a big outward display of it, you're going to probably attract a lot of unwanted attention. And then our whole practice won't go anywhere. So I think I gave this quote earlier, but I really like it, so I'll mention it again. And that is that the harvest of good qualities does not grow on the rocky peaks of pride. they grow in the low, fertile valleys of humility. So really to avoid making a big out display of it. And of course, if you're coming from a conservative family or community or society, and you walk around telling everyone you're a Buddhist now, then maybe you're going to get a lot of unwanted attention. So again, it's not what we call ourselves, and it's what we do with our mind that's important. And of course, if we want to progress, then if there are some ideas that have sprouted in our mind during this week, then it's a little bit like the analogy of planting some seeds in the ground. Is that when those seeds start to sprout, if we want those to grow to a big healthy crop or tree, we need to do two things. We need to protect so it doesn't get eaten or squashed, and we need to nurture. So similarly, if some ideas have sprouted in our mind, we need to do these two things, protect and nurture. So we already mentioned earlier that particularly as a beginner, if there are things around us or people around us that whenever we come into contact with them, they overwhelm us in a negative way, where we react negatively, then to give yourself some space from these heavy negative influences as a beginner. We're not talking, of course, about abandoning people, running away from people, but we are talking about strategic, short-term strategy. Step back as much as you can, give yourself some space so that you can work on yourself. Otherwise, if you just keep getting caught up in these negative situations, you're going to get overwhelmed. Give yourself some space to work on yourself, and then later, if it's particularly a person with that more ability, we can go into those more difficult situations and help those people. But maybe we need to protect ourselves a little bit until we have developed that capacity. And also, of course, we need to nurture. So, I mentioned this already before, but again, very important point is if we have this attitude, I can do this by myself, I think you're going to find it very difficult, if not impossible. That was my experience and experience of many people I talked to, that as a beginner we're not very strong-willed, that we're easily influenced by people and things around us, so we'll probably get swept up in our old habits very easily, and it's very hard to work against that. So we need help. So find other people, like-minded people, the idea of Sangha, spiritual community. Find these people, get associated, support each other, help each other. We need help to move against the stream of modernity which is driving us in the opposite direction in most cultures and societies. And of course, to nurture as well, we need to continue to listen to teachings, reflect, meditate, and so forth. And very helpful as part of that is to regular retreat as well. Ideally at least once a year, because that sort of setting can really give us a boost in our practice. So maybe instead of spending 2 weeks on the beach in the holiday, 1 week on the beach and 1 week doing a meditation retreat. So that is going to help to nurture, to get connected, to nurture yourself through a group retreat setting. And initially, of course, also much better to do group retreat than trying to do solitary retreat. If you've never done solitary retreat and you try to do that even for 1 or 2 days, you're going to find it very difficult, because you have to be self-disciplined, you have to make the structure yourself, and then there's no group sort of energy supporting you. Whereas in a group retreat, of course, there's structure, it's led, and you have group energy holding you as well, so much easier. So start with some group retreats, and then we can slowly start to do a little bit of personal retreat, maybe half a day, a weekend or so forth, and then slowly build up over time. And then, of course, if we want to do this we mentioned in the context of those 6 preconditions that we really need to simplify our life. But often I hear people say, "Oh, I'd really like to meditate, but I simply don't have time to meditate." And again, I think that's never a valid excuse. Of course, the reality is that many of us, or most of us, have very busy, hectic lives. Our days are full of activities, and we don't have enough time to do everything we're trying to do. But of course, some of those activities are essential. Most of us need to work at some level to have enough money, to have a roof over our head and so forth. And so some of us have family responsibilities, and some of us have other essential responsibilities. But again, above and beyond those essential activities that we do, we tend to fill up our day with a lot of stuff, and a lot of these things don't really bring us benefit, and sometimes even brings us harm. And so again, rather than forcibly cut these things out of our life, then what's recommended from the Buddhist perspective is these 2 reflections: precious human life and death. That if we really reflect on precious human life, that we've got a life full of opportunities, and death that's not going to last forever, then we'll be inspired to make our life meaningful and to not put it off, start right now. And I read earlier this quote from Steve Jobs about that. What I'd like to do now is read another short article, and it's all about, people, if we don't do this, then what often happens is we don't make our life meaningful, and then later in life, when we look back on our life, we're full of regrets at having wasted our life. And the article I'm going to read briefly is from an Australian nurse who was working in the hospice movement for 30, 40 years, caring for people terminally ill and people who are dying. And she would talk to them about their biggest regrets in life. And so over that period of 20, 30 years or so, she put together the list of the 5 most common regrets people had about their life. So I'd like to share those now. This is available, of course, on the internet. And the first one is, "I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me." And then she comments on each one. She says, "This was the most common regret of all. When people realise that their life is almost over and look back clearly on it, it is easy to see how many dreams have gone unfulfilled. Most people had not honoured even a half of their dreams and had to die knowing it was due to the choices they had made or not made. Health brings a freedom very few realise until they no longer have it." And that's generally true. We don't tend to appreciate things until we've lost it or are about to lose it. The second regret: "I wish I hadn't worked so hard." This came from every male patient that I nursed. They missed their children's youth and their partner's companionship. Women also spoke of this regret, but as most were from an older generation, many of the female patients had not been breadwinners. All of the men I nursed deeply regretted spending so much of their lives on the treadmill of a work existence. The third one: "I wish I had the courage to express my feelings." Many people suppress their feelings in order to keep peace with others. As a result, they settled for a mediocre existence and never became who they were truly capable of becoming. Many developed illnesses relating to the bitterness and resentment they carried as a result. The fourth regret: "I wish I had stayed in touch with my friends." Often they would not truly realise the full benefits of old friends until their dying weeks, and it was not always possible to track them down. Many had become so caught up in their own lives that they had let golden friendships slip by over the years. There were many deep regrets about not giving relationships the time and effort they deserved. Everyone misses their friends when they are dying. And the fifth one is, "I wish that I had let myself be happier." This is a surprisingly common one. Many did not realise until the end that happiness is a choice. They had stayed stuck in old patterns and habits. The so-called comfort of familiarity overflowed into their emotions as well as their physical lives. Fear of change had them pretending to others and to themselves that they were content, when deep within they longed to laugh properly and have silliness in their life again. And then often when people come into contact with some sort of more spiritual way of looking at life, then often people have this sort of dilemma. And that is, should I do the career thing or should I do the spiritual thing? You know, which one should I do? I think this way of thinking is not helpful, because if we give up our career, how are we going to financially support ourselves? And second, if that career is the one thing we're good at, we've just given up the one thing we can do to benefit the world. So rather than choice, integrate, is to use your talents to benefit the world. And to really be able to integrate, again, I think we really need to shift our worldview. Because if our worldview is that the source of my happiness and fulfillment is coming from out there, then I think no matter what career we have, we're never going to be satisfied. We can be one of the most influential people in the world, a CEO of a huge corporation. We won't be satisfied because we'll never have enough. We'll never get enough. Whereas if we have the worldview that the source of happiness and well-being and fulfillment comes from within, then it's not about what we can get from the world, it's about what we can bring to the world. And then, whatever career we have can be very rewarding, even if it's a very simple career and job, because it's about what we can give to the world. And on that point, I'd like to read part of an email I received a few years ago from a student who attended one of my courses in Dharamsala in India, Tashita. He was a German school teacher, and he said the following. About 2 years ago, I participated in your 7-point mind training course at Tashita. And many times during the past 2 years, I was thinking about sending you a mail and telling you how much those 9 precious days meant to me, and how much in my life sparked out of the inspiration and insights gathered during those days. After the course, I returned home and picked up my life just where I left it, teaching science in high school. But so much had changed. My approach to my work, my life, my friends, and my pupils had changed. Some weeks into the term, I was teaching 11-year-olds for the first time in my life. I started beginning my lessons with little awareness exercises. Those youngsters are so bouncy after breaks, so I was looking for a method to get them focused in class without using force. I taught the benefits of sitting upright for keeping focused, and then little awareness exercises like observing the breath, listening to sounds, tasting chocolate properly, and so on. It took around 3 minutes before the beginning of the class, but somehow it changed everything. To my amazement, the kids just loved doing those exercises. I started to use those techniques also in my other classes from 14 to 18-year-olds, and the same thing happened. They started to demand the exercises, and somehow using these methods, it created a real bonding between my students and myself, culminating in my students asking me to make the speech at their prom night at the end of their high school years, which was pretty amazing. So I think if we really can shift that perspective, that's not about what we can get, but what we can bring, then we can really have a very rewarding life, and we can really start to integrate our career or whatever we're doing in a more spiritual, more meaningful way. And of course, with this, we need that balance. We need inner development and then outward expression. So we need time, of course, to develop ourselves, but then, of course, also we need to be out in the world and benefiting the world. So we need to balance those two activities. Because if we only go out in the world and haven't developed ourselves, then we're not very effective in bringing something to the world, and maybe we're just going to bring our mental afflictions and bring a lot of suffering onto people. And if we only develop ourselves, then there's a very much a danger we just withdraw from society, and we use our training as a way of just sitting in this little bubble of peace here, ignoring the world. And of course that is not very helpful. That's not very healthy. So we need both of those to balance those. How we balance, of course, will depend on where we're at. At some stages in our life, we maybe need to do more inner development. At other times, maybe we need to do more outward. So we need to balance. And then, of course, to develop ourselves, we need to practice. And so, of course, practice has these two parts. Meditation, where we internalise, and integrating into the daily life. That's practice. And then, of course, the core practices we've seen here in all Buddhist traditions are these ethics, of course, foundation, an ethical lifestyle. On that basis, engaging in the Shamatha practice to make our mind serviceable, to cultivate a more calm, clear, focused mind, to make our mind more workable. And then we can use that to transform our mind through the wisdom, Vipashyana practice, and balancing that, of course, with the compassion practice. To apply that mindfulness to gain insights, to apply that mindfulness to cultivate positive qualities. And of course, to do that, we need to put effort to overcome laziness. But remember here, when we say effort, what we don't want to do is see spiritual practice as some sort of hardship that we have to endure. Then we've completely missed the point. Rather, to reflect on the benefits of doing all these practices, and then we'll joyfully do them because we'll see they're bringing us a lot of benefit, even if they're difficult. So very important in spiritual practice to keep this joyful attitude. If we have this sort of idea that it's some sort of hardship we have to go through, then we need to shift that. We need to change that and have this joyous mind. And then, of course, Shantideva gives some very good advice on that. He says, no matter how difficult something seems, everything with practice becomes easy. So we just need to practice and things will become easy. And also, I think, as I mentioned earlier, is that when we're faced with difficulties in our life, to not see them as problems or obstacles, but rather as opportunities. And I think for most of us in our life, we can relate to this, that if our life is going well, then we tend to just float along and not really develop as a person. It's only often when we're challenged with difficulties that we develop as a person trying to overcome those difficulties. So to really see these difficult situations not as problems or obstacles, but as opportunities. But again, to really be able to effectively do that, we really need to shift that worldview. Because as long as our worldview is the source of my happiness and suffering is out there, then of course we're going to see difficult situations as problems because they seem to be causing me suffering. And then of course the world will not appear very user-friendly. And therefore those difficult situations we're going to have aversion because they seem to be causing us suffering. And this was very much highlighted in a study I saw they did some years ago. It was a sort of a pain study. And what they did was they had a group of participants, and each participant I think they had some sort of like heat pad attached to their leg that was creating a lot of pain. And they asked the participants to constantly monitor the level of pain and to give a number between 0 to 100, 100 being the highest. And so initially the average response was the level of pain was 66. And at the same time they had an intravenous drip in the arm of the person, and initially it was just saline solution going in, so nothing. And then they kept asking them to monitor the level of pain they were experiencing. And then what they did, they started to introduce painkiller without telling anyone. And so you would expect the number should start to go down, and it did. It went from 66 to 55. And they kept asking them to monitor. And so they still kept giving painkiller, but now, so nothing changed, but now what they did was they told them they're getting painkiller. Nothing changed, but they just told them, now you're getting painkiller. Magically, 55 went to 39. But now here's the interesting point. They kept giving them painkiller, and now they told them they're stopping the painkiller. So nothing changed, but 39 went to 64. So we can see that it was their aversion that created a lot of their suffering. And so, therefore, if we really see those difficult situations as problems, we're just going to have aversion, we're just going to magnify the suffering we experience. If we can shift that, then we can and see that really this difficult situation is an opportunity and the source of suffering is not there. That difficult situation is not the source of my suffering. What's the source of my suffering is my reaction to that difficult situation. And if we can appreciate that, then we've got something to work with to help change that reaction. So actually it's an opportunity to help us to change that habit of not reacting. And then actually the world will be very user-friendly because everything out there can help us to develop as a person. And then instead of having aversion and creating suffering, we can have compassion and move and develop as a person. And as I mentioned just previously also, continuity, of course, is the key to progress. So continuity, of course, is a daily meditation practice and then integrating the practice into daily life. And we'll look at shortly how to do that. But in addition to that, very helpful to do regular retreat. Again, starting with group retreat. Hopefully at least once a year, if we can manage for a week or 10 days, would be very helpful because it really gives us a boost and we tend to get some inspiration from that retreat as well. And if we start to do some solitary retreat, and what can be very good here, and actually some companies are starting to experiment with this and finding very good results, is there's been 2 major experiments I've seen already to give employees a 4-day working week instead of 5, not jamming extra hours into 4 days, cutting 1 day out completely, so less hours, same pay. And what the studies are showing is that productivity is about 25% higher, so same productivity. The much less staff turnover because the people are much more satisfied in their work and much better harmony in the company, and family life is much improved. So therefore I think for us, of course if we work in such a company it would be fantastic, but if we're self-employed and we can arrange our own time